Welcome to Beneath the Headlines. My name is Mike Woodruff, and each month I host a conversation with an author, a thought or opinion leader, a public intellectual, a professor, politician, somebody who has ideas that are shaping our lives. Beneath the Headlines is a production of the Lake Light Institute. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Brad Wilcox, an author and scholar, a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. Brad is the director of the National Marriage Project, a fellow at both the Institute for Family Studies and the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of a half dozen books, numerous scholarly articles. He has written for or been written about in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, National Review. Brad has an undergraduate degree from UVA and a PhD from Princeton. And Brad and his wife have 9 children. Dr. Wilcox, it's great to have you on the podcast. And
Mike, thanks for
I am going to remind you that we actually met 40 some years ago when we were younger men. You were not even married, so the 9 children had not obviously happened. So anyway, I have been it's been fun to watch you were finishing your PhD. You were at Princeton. I don't know if you had written your dissertation or you were in the midst of researching it, but you were nearing the end. You were about to get married. And you were a very thoughtful guy. And then I started to see your name and I go, oh, look, he's doing what he said he was going to do. And it's been very fun to watch. So thank you for your work. So I want to talk about this book, and I'm asked, "What's the book about?" So I'm just going to ask you that question. A nice slow pitch across the plate. Dr. Wilcox, what's your book about?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's good to be with you. So I grew up in a single parent household, Mike, and I've been sort of concerned for a very long time about how much marriage matters for kids, how marriage tends to connect men to their children. As I've been kind of talking to UVA students in recent years, Mike, what I've been hearing from them is kind of greater concerns about their ability to find a partner worthy of marrying, and even kind of they're not even sure that marriage is kind of like the thing that they want to do. And so kind of my experiences at UVA in part have led me to write a book really about the importance of marriage for adults, for men and women, not just for kids. And then also to kind of give people some hope about how they can go ahead and forge a strong and stable marriage, given the fact that there are voices on the left today who tell us things like from the New York Times that, married motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. That was an op-ed piece in the New York Times a few years ago. And then there are now voices on the right, like Andrew Tate, who said that there is, quote, zero statistical advantage for men when it comes to marriage. So kind of these voices in the public square. And then, my students' experience motivated me to write a book kind of underlining all the ways in which marriage tends to benefit adults, and then to also kind of give them a pathway that they can walk down that maximizes, Mike, their odds of forging a good marriage, for them and any family that they would, build in the wake of getting married. So that's sort of the two things. It's sort of how marriage matters for adults today and how one can go about, forging a strong and stable marriage in 21st century America.
Well, thank you for your book. Fascinating. And I don't know if I want to say it's encouraging or depressing. It's sort of alternately both. And you come out, I'll just say this, you come out swinging. I mean, at first, I think it's the preface. I don't even think it's chapter 1. You've got this, you're comparing the New York Times and Andrew Tate, and you think, wow, neither of those two want to be in the same sentence unless they're trying to take the other one down. But you argue that they're both basically have a message that says, hey, your life should be about work, money, freedom, and an unencumbered life. And so they both, arguably coming from very different worldviews, have this perspective that marriage is, it's for losers.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I think that's sort of the kind of language that Andrew Tate would use, Mike, about, marriage, or he would sort of say it basically sets you up to lose, and I think for a lot of the feminists who I kind of focus on as well, they would also look at it as a transition to loss for women, that you're giving up so much as a woman when you get married and have kids, and you really get nothing in return in in a response for making the move into marriage and family life as a woman.
So, so we mentioned Andrew Tate. Obviously, I don't think anyone confuses Andrew Tate with the elite, but nobody really claims to be a member of the elite. I mean, I heard the other day that Ted Cruz, who's got a Harvard law degree and is a member of the United States Senate, ran for president, married to a McKinsey partner. He claims he's not a member of the elite. And then Elizabeth Warren, who's Ivy League degrees and a professor at an Ivy League institution and a member of the U.S. Senate and has run for president, she claims she's not part of the elite. So you have a very impressive resume. I could argue you're part of the elite. Who are the elite that you're going after?
Yeah, so I would argue that largely kind of college-educated, more liberal-minded adults would tend to dominate the sort of heights of the culture, and would be thinking about people like professors, journalists, C-suite executives, professionals like in medicine and psychology and psychiatry, and they kind of shape the culture, the law, and the public policy environment that we swim in. And of course, there are exceptions like myself when it comes to my views about marriage. But I argue in my book that a lot of our elites have tended to kind of embrace a talk left, walk right approach to marriage and family, Mike, where in their own personal lives, actually, Mike, most of them get married, most of them stay married, most are good spouses, good parents. They benefit from marriage. They benefit from what I would call a family first lifestyle for themselves and for their kin, their kids. But they don't publicly stand for marriage. And often they will attack marriage because, it's sort of the case that they can kind of benefit, in terms of their status in the public square, or they've kind of latched onto a progressive ideology that looks, askance at marriage officially. Or they want to kind of think of themselves as sort of tolerant and accepting of diversity. And they think that any kind of, talk about marriage would be in tension with their commitment to, being a tolerant or a diverse, the kind of person who would welcome diversity of any, form. So that's what I kind of talk about in the book, is just the way in which many of our elites who kind of shape the culture that we operate in, Mike, are not publicly standing for marriage and family, even though they're privately oftentimes benefiting from the institution.
So how do the critics of what you're saying respond to that? I remember, and I think I probably got it from you maybe 10 years ago, but I remember being in conversations with some friends who were arguing left, and I didn't have this, talk left, live right, but I just said, you live the most traditional life of anybody that I know, and yet you're arguing. And it seems to me like you are trying to get your children to follow in your footsteps, but you're arguing for something that just doesn't seem to me like it's going to work, and it's going to be a disaster, and you're arguing for it. And so I guess when you make this case at the university, when you make this case with your colleagues at UVA or in an op-ed in the New York Times, I mean, I can imagine that it doesn't go over well, but I guess I'm just curious, does it have any purchase?
So I think that there are some, and my friend and sort of colleague, Melissa Kearney, is a professor of economics at the University of Maryland and a Brookings scholar as well. She begins her recent book, The Two-Parent Privilege, by talking about how she would go to economics conferences or academic conferences more generally and kind of talk about the importance of marriage in kids' lives. And people would kind of pull her aside afterwards and say, Melissa, what are you doing? I'm kind of signaling that they agree with her, but sort of it's impolitique, So there's plenty of that. I mean, people who are smart enough, they know the data. They've either run the data themselves, or they just know that this is what you find in research on this. But they don't think it's kind of what you should be saying in polite company. So there's that crowd, right? And they're not going to really object because they know you're right. And there's kind of a more ideologically driven crowd, though, who would sort of say, well, yeah, there's a correlation, Mike, between marriage and child well-being, but it's a correlation. It's not causal. And they would argue that what really matters here is that certain types of people, especially today, select into marriage. They're more educated, more affluent, maybe more socially adept, whatever it might be. And it's these underlying traits or characteristics and or these advantages that they've accumulated prior to getting married that really explain why they're more likely to be flourishing, when it comes to marriage and family, and why their kids too are more likely to be flourishing. They're just well resourced on a number of fronts, and being married is just one manifestation of their privilege, to use a term that was, abused 5 years ago frequently. So I think that's the short summary of kind of the smart people know that there's a strong correlation between marriage and financial well-being and kids flourishing. But the smart liberal critics would argue against my position that I'm just kind of mapping out a correlation that's not causal. I think the other thing they would say too nowadays as well is that it's hard for women today to find a man who's worthy of dating, mating, marrying, and having kids with. And so even though marriage might theoretically be a good thing, it's hard in the real world for women to find men who are worthy of entering, into marriage with as well. That would be a second point that I hear, articulated a fair bit as well.
Yeah. So I spoke recently with Nancy Piercy, and she was citing some of your work. And I was just reflecting on that later on. So I'm a pastor, and about a year ago, I discovered, we have several campuses. I discovered that we had a lot more young people showing up at singles events. And it was sort of post-COVID, and everybody was coming out, and it felt like I thought, oh, well, there's this group of people who sort of, the lockdown hit them at a particularly rough time in terms of their social life. And so I said, well, I want to go to this. I want to be at one of these events. And my takeaway was, I was much more impressed with the women than I was with the men. And it was hard to know. I felt sorry for some of the women. And I continue to, Piercy's book, The Toxic War Against Masculinity, sort of argues that a lot of men are failing. We've been hearing that. So I'm guessing that you don't just have anecdotal information on this, but you would also make this point that the complaints of women have some justification.
That's true. I think I would say a couple of things about this. I think in terms of there's just plenty of evidence, Mike, that our boys and our men are floundering at much higher rates on some key outcomes than girls and young men. I just mentioned, in a recent piece that I was at my daughter's eighth grade middle school graduation.
And the girls cleaned up.
And the girls cleaned up in terms of the awards. And that's one example, but we could, more systematically, about 2/3 of the top performers in high school are female. About 2/3 of the worst performers in high school are male. As Richard Reeves points out in his book of Boys and Men. We're now moving to a world where about 60% of college students are female, about 40% are male. In a lot of younger adult professions, women are often doing better than men on average. And of course, it's still the case when you look at the most elite precincts, there are a good number of guys who are just killing it. But when you look at kind of the broader patterns, Mike, you see that both here in the US, but also globally, in much of the developed world, women are often outperforming men educationally and in the early stages of their workforce, arena in the marketplace. So this is a huge problem because women tend to like to marry guys who are roughly, at their level, or even more accomplished than they are, right? So a lot of women are having difficulty finding men who measure up to their expectations of what a guy should be doing today.
So you mentioned Reeves, and I'm familiar with his book. I'm guessing you're familiar, this is probably 10 years old now, the work by Meg Jay at Berkeley on 30 is now the new 20, or 20, yes. However that works. So it strikes me that they both were coming at this more from a position on the left.
Yes.
How has their work been received?
I think that both Meg Jay, who's actually now a colleague at UVA with me, and Richard Reeves, initially there was a little bit of concern, but I think as the evidence is mounted about, kind of the difficulty that 20-somethings often have in kind of getting their lives started, and the difficulty that males are having, and the effects it's had on voting too, I think, means that most people in the center left, the center and the right are very open to the arguments made by Richard Reeves and Meg Jay.
Okay.
So I think one thing that's constructive and encouraging is even the New York Times this past weekend had a piece in its data-driven platform, The Upshot, on how boys are floundering and attributing it to the lack of male role models in many sectors. And they said that there are 3 exceptions. Most places where boys hang out are dominated by women. School, and they just list 17 different domains. The 3 exceptions are sports, scouts, and church. Those are 3 domains where boys can encounter men in larger numbers. But the point of the New York Times article was that boys don't encounter enough, male role modeling in the worlds they travel in today. And that explains in part why they're floundering.
So let me give you an opportunity here to make the case to a young man or woman, but we've talked about, to some extent, I think the women feel a little bit handicapped because they're not finding their peers, however we want to state that. But what do you say to the, not Andrew Tate necessarily, but to those who would say, look, I'm in my 20s. I'm climbing the corporate ladder. I've got to work out. I'm going to delay marriage because that's the best for my career, and I need me time. And here we go. So maybe this is a UVA student you wrote the book for these people. What is the argument? What's the crux of the argument that you make?
The crux argument that I would give to a 20-something guy is that if you're in a good relationship, or even if you think you have the ability to forge a good relationship, you're in a milieu where you might either through church or through your workplace or your college environment meet some good women. That getting married in your 20s is a great way to get sort of started in life, to get your vocation going. I mean, I am a Catholic, Christian. I do believe that, we have different vocations, and plenty of us are called to marriage. And so if your vocation is to marriage and family life as a guy, then I think you should get on with it, get going. And what we see is that men who embrace the vocation of marriage, if you will, or men, in more secular terms, men who get married and embrace their reality, as a husband and a father, are more likely to be happy. They're less lonely. They report more meaningful lives, and they also earn a premium. Guys who are married with their own kids in the household earn the most money, net of controls for things like education and age and race and whatnot. And it's not rocket science, right? If you think about it, when you're married with kids, you have a much higher motivation to support them financially. And you're going to be more adept at navigating, typically, the work world than your male peers who are not married with kids. So I just think it's about kind of understanding, appreciating that the assumption of responsibility for men actually is actually a source of profound fulfillment, not in the sort of 70s style, use of that, but just like it gives your life, again, meaning, direction, purpose, and a sense of satisfaction, knowing that you're living for something bigger than yourself is sort of another way to put it. Okay.
So two other arguments that I hear from younger people. One is, this isn't the time. I should, I've got to get everything established. I've got to get my career going, all that. Second one is, haven't found my soulmate. So I know you wrote specifically about this. So share with the audience what your argument here.
So I think it depends how you define soulmate, but I think a lot of people think about marriage and love in terms of like this intense emotional connection. And they think that once you get married, you're going to kind of enjoy this intense, connection with someone. It's going to be often romantic. It's going to be relatively frictionless. It's going to be, a source of real ongoing passion and purpose. And it's going to be just like you fit together like a hand and glove. And I think the danger with that approach is it doesn't appreciate that we are all ordinary human beings. In a Christian language, we're all sinners. And that once you're in any kind of long-term relationship with anyone, I don't care how perfect they might seem or perfect you might seem entering into it, there's going to be plenty of friction and conflict and difficulty. And so I think the problem with the soulmate mentality is it sort of assumes that marriage and love are about feelings and a sense of romantic connection, and that if those things seem to be going away, then the love is over, the marriage is over. And my view about married love is that, and I'm influenced here by St. Thomas Aquinas, is that love is a decision to will the good of the other. And then once you have kids, will the good of the others, plural. And so that is sort of a better way to think about marriage, and not think about feelings as the foundation for your marriage. Thinking about love in the sense of the good of the other is the better way. So I'm saying, in terms of looking around though for a spouse, so all I would say is that it's important to find someone with whom you would be a good friend. Recognizing you're not going to be, oftentimes like perfectly suited for one another on all sorts of levels, and you can have disagreements and find some things about them that aren't perfect. One concrete example is actually for a female, but it kind of makes the point, is there is a very kind of gifted writer and psychologist named Leslie Gottlieb who writes about, love and family for The Atlantic. And she wrote a book entitled Just Marry Him. And she begins her story talking about how she had a long list of like 124 things that she was looking for in a potential spouse. And then she kind of fast forwards a couple of years, in her life, and tells the reader that she's in a park in Los Angeles on a Saturday morning with her toddler son, I think it was. And she looks around the park and she sees a bunch of other parents with their toddlers. Those other parents are men, they're dads. She's there as a single mom. And she had this child on her own. And just because it makes the point that had she been less picky about all the different traits and characteristics that she was looking for in a spouse, she probably would have gotten married, had her kid in marriage, and would have been sending dad to the park on Saturday morning and enjoying probably a coffee with her girlfriends. Mm-hmm. So her point, though, obviously, is just, you need to have some non-negotiables when you're looking for a spouse, but don't come up with, pages and pages of right. Criteria.
Yeah. 124 items. Wow, that's a tall order. Okay. The third objection that I hear, and this maybe is not germane to you as a sociologist so much, but, this is the third objection I hear. The world's too crazy. We don't need, I can't get married and bring another life into this world. That would be irresponsible for whatever reason. So do you hear that from your UVA students?
Sure. I mean, but of course it's a little bit naive, right? I mean, compared to what? Like, having a kid, in Austria in 1941, or, a kid in 1935 in the United States in the middle of the Great Depression. I mean, obviously that what people have had kids in much worse circumstances than we now face. But I would just sort of flip it and just sort of saying, look, I mean, besides my wife, the most important things in my life are my kids. And my life would be much, more meaningless, and I'd be a much lonelier fellow if I didn't have my 9 children. I mean, I was just last night, at 8:15 in the evening, playing hide and go seek in the neighborhood pool with my youngest son, who's 11. And that's one of the beautiful things about being 53, and still having like an opportunity to, be doing fun things with kids in a neighborhood pool. And, I think there are plenty of folks who are single and childless who they miss out on so much. I mean, or traveling, we've had a chance to travel because my sister-in-law worked for Delta, so we could travel a lot of places, but like going to Greece and the Acropolis, with my kids and taking in all that history, hearing about, St. Paul and Mars Hill. I mean, it's just, and then sort of seeing it sort of through the eyes of my children and the ears of my kids. I mean, it's just such a more meaningful experience. So I'm just saying, like, you don't know what you're missing until you have kids. Now, obviously kids can be hard and stressful and difficult. We all know that, toddlers, but there's just a kind of depth of meaning and purpose and, joy that I think comes often from having kids that people who don't have them don't appreciate.
Yeah. Well, Sherry and I are now cycling through, starting into the grandparenting phase. So yes, kids are just delightful. I heard somewhere that there's two things adults can sit and stare at. One is besides fire and water. The third thing is a baby. You just sit and stare, and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I don't want to leave. So yeah. Well, so let me ask you. Do you have scenarios about where we're at? I mean, there's obviously a lot of suddenly a lot of recognition that we have a depopulation crisis looming, and we've got marriage rates at the lowest ever, and people don't understand that. Yes, the population of the planet is continuing to go up because we're living longer, but we're not having children to replace at the replacement levels, and there's some very accelerating deleterious aspects to the future. So are there a couple scenarios that you are playing out in your head about, okay, if we pivot, here's plan A, here's plan B, or here's option B and here's option C?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike. I mean, I think kind of on the current course, we're projected to, see the global population fall in this century. And probably start to fall in the next 30 or 40 years. So that's not what any of us would have, I think, expected, back at the end of the last century. But I do think, history doesn't move in a linear direction. I think many people kind of implicitly or explicitly assume that's the case, Mike. They think it's just going to kind of keep going the same way it's gone the last, 20 or 30 years. And my suspicion is that there'll be at least some cultures that will figure out a way to make marriage and family life much more sort of attractive and appealing and high status. And those cultures will, actually see a kind of fertility rebound. Now, and we're still, I think, going to see, just given the trajectory that we're on right now, declines in the center. But I think there are going to be some cultures that kind of figure out how to make family life more appealing, more attractive, more affordable as well, and in ways that lead to a kind of rebound. But we haven't yet. I mean, the closest approximate to that right now would be Israel. I mean, they're still at replacement. Even secular Israelis have replacement level fertility. Religious Israelis have even obviously greater fertility. So that's one exception. But I think we'll find probably in the next 20 years, there'll be some other countries and cultures that sort of figure out how to make marriage and family life more central, and therefore bring the fertility rate back up to replacement levels.
I was in Israel.
Sorry, one more thing on that. I think it's religion is going to be key to that too, Mike. So that's certainly the Israeli story as well, as you know. So I'm just saying, so I could see, even in the United States, for instance, a scenario where Catholics and evangelicals kind of took a turn and just became more, both somewhat more intensively faithful and also more deliberately committed to having, larger families. And then that would lead to a kind of Israel year that would change the demographic and the cultural and the political fabric of the U.S.
I was in Israel 2 years ago, I guess, maybe 3. It was well before October 7th, and I was leading a tour, and I just was amazed. I go, there's so much energy in this space. I said, I don't exactly know how to describe it. I have felt, I'll get myself canceled, but I have felt this when I'm in Illinois, Chicago, a very blue state. When I go to Indiana, or when I go to Iowa, when I'm visiting Georgia, I'm in Arkansas visiting my mom, I'm in Texas visiting a friend. I go, there's more energy here. I see more young families. I see more pregnant women. There's something healthy here. And Yeah, let me ask this. So I asked about the criticism and the way people respond to your work. Do you get more pushback for advocating marriage or early marriage than you do for advocating children, or is it just they sort of one and the same?
I would say kind of the marriage piece is still more difficult than the children piece. In terms of pushback. But I do think that at least in the center and the center left, there's a new openness, Mike, to these kinds of arguments because I think the recognition is mounting that we are facing a demographic
challenge,
tsunami.
Yep.
So you can't kind of look at these projections and just sort of like dismiss the idea that we need to think more about how do we create a culture that's family friendly.
Do you think that there's something? Well, let me frame this differently. If you were in charge, I'm going to put you in charge of legislative agenda, and you can get the laws passed that you want. My understanding has been that governments can do some things that suppress the number of children people have, but it's very hard for them to sort of spike it in a healthy way. Is that?
I think that's true, I think we have to realize that culture is the most important thing, right? Is what I would say when it comes to reviving the fortunes of the family. But government can help create a policy context where it's easier for families to have the kids that they would like to have, is sort of how I would say. And also where we can stop penalizing marriage. So if I was put in charge, I would eliminate what's called the marriage penalty, Mike, and that applies to a lot of means-tested programs that working class families across the U.S. pretty hard. So Medicaid and food stamps would be the two things I'd focus on. And if you talk to working class couples with kids, you know that these two programs, especially Medicaid, is a big issue. I've talked to couples with young kids here in Virginia, look at data on this. It's an issue. They're choosing between marriage and Medicaid, basically. That's a bad thing. So I would address that marriage penalty in our means-tested programs. I would figure out ways to reduce the cost of single-family housing, primarily through reducing regulations, increasing the density, too, of single-family housing as it's laid out, make it more affordable to middle-class families especially. I would really tackle like PSAs, making marriage and parenthood like the facts known to the general public, tackle how schools talk about love, relationships, and family in a very deliberate way as well, changing the culture in that sense for public schools. Do more school choice too, to give kids and families opportunities to go to private religious schools. And that would be kind of those would be the kinds of things that I think would be helpful in creating a context where it's easier to get married and have kids, addressing, the housing costs, some of these cultural issues, and making sure that we're not penalizing marriage among, broadly speaking, working class, lower middle class families. But then, you have to have church, you have to have civic institutions, other cultural shaping institutions doing their part as well.
Okay, so I want to pivot towards the final four questions. So sort of rapid fire, top of mind. Number one, what if anything keeps you up at night?
I think the worst case scenario when it comes to demography makes me worried. I mean, I obviously have a lot of kids, and just if we see dramatic declines in fertility that never really go away, we're talking about a situation where we're going to experience, I think, economic and political and, social unrest, basically. There's going to be a lot of suffering if the fertility, at least on current course, goes way down. So that would be one of my concerns.
So I just have to, I'm just going to point out an irony here. So I've done, 35 of these interviews, maybe more. I've asked everybody that question. So Brad, you're the first one to not say My own children keep me up at night. That is the number one thing. Doesn't matter what we've been talking about, politics, sport, athletics. People say, oh, well, I stay worried about my kids. So to some extent, you said that. Yes, I've got 9 kids and I'm worried about society if it doesn't turn. So I guess you're adjacent to that. I won't say you didn't check that box.
Right.
So the second question, what's on your nightstand? What are you reading right now?
There's a book about it's a book about Easter. It's an Easter theology, if you will. And then there is
who wrote it?
It's an Irish Catholic priest, but I can't remember his name.
Is it O'Donoghue?
Yeah, I can't remember his name. Yeah,
okay.
Just got it from a friend. And there's a new series, 3-part series on the American Revolution, written by a former Washington Post war correspondent, and I'm in the first volume, and we're at the section in the book where he's talking about kind of an American attack on Montreal. But it's a good kind of overview of the American Revolution.
Okay.
So yeah.
What book or podcast or Amazon product or Netflix series or something have you recommended more than anything else in the last couple of years?
I like Modern Wisdom when it comes to podcasts. It's just kind of a heterodox new podcast that really tackles a lot of contemporary issues related to dating, marriage, family, and men's concerns. So that would be certainly one podcast that's, I think, up and coming, if you will. And
called Modern Wisdom.
Modern Wisdom, yes. Chris Williamson. He's an English guy, very interesting background. Club promoter, male model. He's done everything basically. But very good interviewer. He's based now in Austin, Texas, as many of these folks are. In terms of books, I would say, I've classically sort of turned to Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, kind of just to give us a very good, I think, this is now an oldie but goodie, but kind of overview of the kinds of cultural and political currents that we're navigating today is addressed in McIntyre's book quite well.
Okay. Last question. What are you working on now? What's the next book or article or whatever?
I'm doing a piece for The Atlantic on, it's tentatively titled The Marriage Comeback, and talking about how for all of the travails that marriage is facing, particularly for adults, it looks like for kids, marriage is reemerging as the anchor of American family life. And what I mean by that is that for a long time, divorce seemed to be increasing relentlessly, single-parented, relentlessly, and marriage was in decline for married families. But today we're seeing a growing share of kids being raised by stably married parent families. Okay.
Well, Brad, thank you so much, not just for this book, but your time and the work, your body of work over the last 40 years. So as somebody who has watched from the cheap seats in Chicago, I've appreciated it very much. So,
well, thanks, Mike, for having me on. I appreciate the time today.
Thank you.